Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping into a really fascinating and maybe misunderstood period of thought, 1,000 years of philosophy, basically. We're using Sir Anthony Kenny's work as our guide.
That's right.
And our goal here is to get past this idea that the time between, say, Rome's fall and the Renaissance was just dark or simple.
Yeah, that Dark Ages label really misses the mark when it comes to philosophy. It's just wrong. When you actually dig into the sources from around 400 AD up to the 1400s.
You find something else entirely.
Exactly. You find incredible intellectual energy, real rigor. Thinkers like Augustine laying foundations, and then later you get these huge, complex systems from people like Aquinas, Scotus. It wasn't just keeping old ideas alive, it was building something new and honestly pretty intense.
Okay, so let's get into that, because the typical story is, the Greeks did philosophy, then nothing much happened until the Renaissance picked it back up. What makes this medieval period so distinct? You mentioned rigor.
Yeah, and structure. One key thing is how professionalized philosophy became. It wasn't just wealthy guys musing anymore or traveling teachers.
Right, it moved into institutions.
Precisely. Into the new universities, Oxford, Paris, places like that. These became hubs with a shared curriculum, standard texts, lots of Aristotle once they got the Latin translations, and this is crucial, a shared technical language.
So very specialized terminology.
Very. And most of the writing we have from that time, it's not personal journals, it's university work, lecture notes, logic exercises, records of formal debates, these things called disputations.
But doesn't that sound a bit restrictive? If everyone's using the same text, the same jargon, does that maybe limit thinking? Like, are they just arguing over the details instead of having big new ideas?
That's a really fair question, and it connects to something interesting. You called it the personality paradox. A lot of these medieval thinkers, compared to someone like Augustine earlier or philosophers later, they do seem a bit anonymous in their writing.
Less personal flair.
Yeah, the focus was squarely on the argument, the logic, not the author's personality, but about originality being stifled. Actually, the opposite might be true. See, most major figures were in religious orders. Dominicans, Franciscans.
Which makes people think it's all just theology, right? Just defending the faith.
That's the common misconception, yeah. But it's a misunderstanding. While, sure, many ended up focusing on theology later in their careers, they were incredibly careful about distinguishing philosophy from religious dogma.
They had to be clear about their starting points.
Absolutely. They deliberately tried to build arguments using only reason, premises that any educated person, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, could logically accept before they brought in scripture. That discipline, that separation, it actually pushed them to be more philosophically inventive, not less.
Okay, so to really get how they did that, blending faith and reason, we probably need to go back to the beginning. Late 4th century, St. Augustine.
Augustine is foundational. Absolutely massive figure. His big work, The City of God, took him 13 years to write it. That's really the first major attempt to weave together classical thought, especially Plato and the Neoplatonists, with a Christian framework.
And you find these moments in Augustine that feel startlingly modern.
Yeah.
Like on the Trinity, he's digging into how we know things, epistemology, and he comes up with this argument for self-awareness.
Ah, yes, the I am living, therefore I know I am living idea.
Which sounds so much like Descartes, I think, therefore I am. But it's, what, 1,200 years earlier?
Yeah.
It just shows the depth there, even that early on.
It really does. Then fast forward about a century, early 6th century, you get Boethius, famously wrote The Consolation of Philosophy while imprisoned.
Yeah, people love that book. For the writing, but also the philosophy itself. And he tackles that huge issue. Divine foreknowledge versus free will.
The classic dilemma. If God already knows what I'm going to choose tomorrow, how is my choice actually free? It seems predetermined.
So how did Boethius handle it?
His solution was really clever. He argued that God's knowledge isn't really foreknowledge because God exists outside of time altogether.
Outside of time, how does that work?
Well, for God, there's no past or future, just an eternal present. So God doesn't foresee your choice in the way we think about it. God simply sees your choice as it happens in that eternal now.
Huh. So God observing you doesn't force your hand, basically.
That's the idea. And that concept, hugely influential for Christian thinkers for centuries.
Okay, so Augustine and Boethius provide this Latin Christian foundation. But it wasn't happening in isolation, was it? The influence from the East, from Islamic thinkers, seems critical.
Oh, absolutely crucial. You can't understand medieval European philosophy without understanding the impact of thinkers from the Islamic world. They preserved so many Greek texts, but they also built incredibly sophisticated systems of their own.
Right. The sources emphasize that Latin translations of people like Avicenna ibn Sina and Averroes ibn Rushd were just as important, maybe even more so sometimes, than earlier Christian writers for the big university debates.
Avicenna especially, we're talking 10th, 11th centuries, a true polymath doctor, logician, you name it. His philosophical system, particularly his metaphysics, was groundbreaking. He really dug into the distinction between a thing's essence, what it is, and its existence that it is.
And that distinction became really important, didn't it? Because it let later thinkers argue that existence isn't automatically part of something's definition, so it must come from somewhere else.
Yeah.
Like a creator.
Exactly. That line of argument relies heavily on Avicenna's work. His ideas traveled, became central in Latin universities, even though some conservative Muslims back home were suspicious of his Greek-influenced philosophy.
And then there's Maimonides, Musa ibn Mimon, the great Jewish philosopher, also trying to reconcile philosophy and religion, but taking a very different path.
A really radical path in some ways. It's often called negative theology.
Negative theology, what's that mean? It sounds like the opposite of what most theologians try to do.
Kind of, yeah. Maimonides basically argued that we humans share no common ground with God's essential nature. Therefore, we can't actually say anything positive about what God is.
Wait, nothing. So you can't say God is good or God is wise.
Not literally, according to Maimonides, because good and wise are human concepts. We can only understand them in human terms. So applying them directly to God doesn't really work.
So, what can you say?
You can only say what God is not. You can say God is not unjust, or God is not limited, or God is not ignorant. By stripping away imperfections, you get closer, but you never arrive at a positive description.
Wow. That's a completely different way of thinking about it, defining God by negation.
It's incredibly sophisticated, and it provided this fascinating counterpoint to the more positive approaches developing in Christian scholasticism.
Okay, so all this interaction, Augustine, Boethius, plus this massive influx from Avicenna, Averroes, Maimonides, it sets the stage for what we call the high point, right?
Mm-hmm.
The 13th and 14th centuries, high scholasticism, driven largely by the friars.
Exactly. The mendicant orders, the Dominicans, the Black Friars, and the Franciscans, the Grey Friars, they became the powerhouses in the universities.
And there was rivalry between them.
Oh, yeah. Intellectual competition, sometimes quite fierce. And that rivalry actually fueled a lot of philosophical development. You get these giants emerging. Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas were Dominicans. Bonaventure, Duns Scotus, William of Ockham were Franciscans.
And Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274. He's often seen as the absolute peak, the great synthesizer, taking Aristotle, this pagan philosopher, rediscovered via the Islamic world, and weaving him fully into Christian thought.
His achievement was immense, and a lot of it was down to his method. Remember we talked about using premises acceptable to reason alone?
Right, natural theology.
That's Aquinas' specialty. He systematically tried to demonstrate truths about God and reality using only observation and logic, things anyone could potentially accept regardless of their faith.
So he's trying to prove God without starting from the Bible. That's what made his arguments so powerful in that academic setting.
Precisely. His most famous arguments, the 5 ways for God's existence. They all start from observable facts about the world. Things move, things cause other things exist contingently, and argue logically back to a necessary first cause or prime mover.
But the Dominicans, like Aquinas, didn't get the final say. The Franciscans had their own major figures. John Duns Scotus, the subtle doctor. Sounds like he complicated things.
He absolutely did. If Aquinas built the grand synthesis, Scotus was brilliant at finding the weak points, the ambiguities, and pushing philosophy in new, complex directions. He challenged Aquinas on some fundamental points.
Like the idea of being itself, how we talk about existence.
Exactly. Aquinas thought being or existence was analogical, meaning when we say God exists and a rock exists, the word exists is used similarly, but not in the exact same sense. God's existence is fundamentally different.
Okay, similar but different meanings. What did Scotus say?
Scotus argued, no, being is univocal. It means the exact same thing whether you apply it to God or a creature or a rock.
The concept of existence is the same.
Yes. The concept is the same, even if the way God exists, infinitely necessarily, is totally different from how creatures exist, finitely, contingently.
This seems like a subtle shift, but I bet it had big consequences.
Huge consequences. It arguably made God more graspable by human reason because being was a shared concept, but it also potentially made God subject to the same logical rules as everything else. And Scotus's complex ideas about metaphysics, logic, free will, they became the standard framework debated for centuries, right into the Reformation. His work laid down intellectual tracks everyone else had to follow or react against.
And then, following Scotus, we get another Franciscan who really shook things up, William of Ockham, 14th century. He's associated with nominalism.
Ockham is a turning point. He mounted a direct challenge to the realism of thinkers like Aquinas and Scotus, who believed universals concepts like humanity or redness had some kind of reality outside the mind.
And Ockham
said no. Universals aren't real things floating out there. They're just names nomina in Latin, hence nominalism, or they're mental concepts. Humanity is just a sign, a label our minds use to conveniently group together many individual humans. Only the individuals are truly real.
Okay, that sounds like a radical simplification. Is this where Occam's razor comes from? The idea of not multiplying entities beyond necessity?
Pretty much. That principle of intellectual parsimony, shave away unnecessary assumptions, is classic Occam. If you can explain how we talk and think about the world without positing these extra real things called universals, then don't posit them. Focus on the individuals we actually experience.
But Occam wasn't just a logician locked away somewhere, was he? His life got pretty dramatic. Politically dramatic.
Extremely. He got deeply involved in a major dispute about poverty. The Franciscans argued that Christ and the apostles owned absolutely nothing, setting a standard for the church. Pope John II disagreed forcefully. Occam sided with the radical Franciscan view.
Sided how? Just writing treatises.
Oh, much more than that. He basically declared the Pope's official pronouncements on the matter heretical. He called them wicked, absurd, and heretical.
Wow. You don't just call the Pope a heretic lightly back then.
Absolutely not. He had to flee the papal court in Avignon for his own safety and spent years living under the protection of the Holy Roman Emperor in Munich, who was the Pope's political rival. It shows these philosophical debates weren't abstract games. They were tied to real power struggles.
That's incredible. A logician turned political refugee.
Hmm.
What strikes me, though, is that even as Occam's nominalism started to unravel some of the big scholastic systems, the method that intense focus on logic didn't just vanish.
Not at all. And here's a fascinating historical loop. Fast forward to the 20th century, Oxford. You have this intense focus on analyzing ordinary language, logic, propositions, the peak of analytic philosophy.
Wittgenstein, Austin, Ryle.
Exactly. Well, their methods, their obsession with linguistic precision and logical structure, were arguably closer to the way medieval logicians worked than almost anything that happened in philosophy between the Renaissance and the 20th century.
So we kind of forgot their toolkit for a few hundred years and then accidentally reinvented parts of it.
In a way, yes. The medievals were deeply concerned with logic, meaning how arguments work, avoiding fallacies. Think back even earlier, 12th century, Peter Abelard.
Abelard, famous for the tragic romance, but also for sic et non, yes and no.
Precisely. Sic et non was basically a textbook for the method. Abelard would present conflicting quotes from respected authorities, the Bible, church fathers, on a particular question. Like, Augustine seems to say X, but Ambrose seems to say not X.
And the point was?
The point was to force students to use logic and careful analysis to resolve the apparent contradiction. Figure out if the words were being used differently, if the context was different, or if one authority was simply more reliable on that point. It's the direct ancestor of the formal disputation method used by Aquinas and everyone later.
And Abelard also weighed in on that universals debate, didn't he? Trying to find a middle ground.
He did. He was trying to navigate between the idea that universals are real things, realism, and Occam's later view that they're just names, nominalism. Abelard suggested universality isn't a thing, but maybe a status.
A status.
Yeah, like a shared condition or reason why a name like man correctly applies to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. It's about the concept and how it functions logically to group individuals. It's a focus on concepts and language, which feels very, well, almost modern again.
So let's try to wrap this up for listeners.
Yeah.
We've journeyed through this 1,000-year period, often dismissed as the Dark Ages. But what we've actually found is, well, something incredibly dynamic.
Definitely not dark. It was rigorous, highly professionalized within universities, and surprisingly international, with crucial ideas flowing from Islamic and Jewish thinkers like Avicenna and Maimonides.
And they tackled the biggest questions, didn't they?
Yeah.
Free will, God's nature, the nature of reality itself,
Yeah.
using logical tools that were incredibly sharp.
Absolutely. That period, especially the 13th and 14th centuries, with Aquinas, Scotus, Ockham wrestling with the nature of existence and knowledge, that was a genuine peak in Western intellectual history. Its influence is baked into so much of what came later.
It really drives home that fundamental questions persist, and the drive for logical clarity is constant, even if the frameworks change.
And sometimes, even with the sharpest clarity, you hit a limit. Think about Nicholas of Cusa, right at the transition towards the Renaissance. He had this idea about truth and God, the coincidentia positorum.
The coincidence of opposites.
Yeah, the idea that ultimate reality, especially God, might have to hold contradictory truths together somehow. And he used this really powerful metaphor.
The polygon and the circle, I remember that.
Exactly. He said our rational investigation is like drawing a polygon inside a circle. We can keep adding sides to the polygon, making our understanding more complex, more refined through reason and argument, making it look more and more like the circle. But no matter how many sides you add, millions, billions, the polygon will never perfectly become the circle. There's always that infinitesimal yet infinite gap.
An infinite gap between our reason and ultimate reality.
That was his point. Which leaves us with a thought for you, the listener. If even these incredibly sophisticated medieval minds concluded there's a limit, an infinite gap, what problem are we tackling today, maybe in science, technology, philosophy, ethics, thinking it's a solvable polygon, when perhaps, just perhaps, it's fundamentally an unreachable circle?
Something to think about until our next deep dive.